Over 50 years ago, the Supreme Court decided a case called Lemon versus Kurtzman that severely restricted your religious freedom. It was intended to keep your expressions of faith suppressed and hidden away. And it worked. Religious monuments were taken down. Your liberties were restricted. And people of faith could be punished for freely exercising their beliefs. Which is not what America's founders intended. But half a century later, in 2022, after impacting thousands of cases, Lemon was finally overturned by First Liberty at the Supreme Court. The result, after decades of suppression, your legal rights have been fully restored, bringing you more religious freedom than in generations. As part of America's rich history and tradition for public expressions of faith, religious monuments can come out of the shadows at last and go back in place where they belong. That also includes nativity scenes on your courthouse square and menorahs in your city parks. You can freely express your faith in public or at work, but not everyone knows the laws have changed, and they're bullied into silence. Well-funded groups keep filing lawsuits to drive people of faith back into the shadows, doing everything they can to rewrite the history of our country and slam our door of opportunity shut. That's why First Liberty launched Restoring Faith in America, a culture-changing initiative to educate, inspire, and empower people of faith to become a faith blazer in your own community. Restoring Faith in America will keep leading the way, and First Liberty will keep fighting for you, your kids, and your grandkids. Join us in fighting for what matters most. Create a plan to restore faith in your community. Reach out to us at rfia@firstliberty.org.
We are better together. We are a highly leveraged movement, and the Restoring Faith in America is the religious liberty focus of Family Policy Alliance and many of our family policy councils for the next year. We've fought for decades as a movement for the right to be able to do this. It's only natural that after we have the right to do it, we should show up and do it. We have the blessing of Family Policy Alliance of hosting a local movement that leads toward Washington, D.C., so we actually have those hands and feet that we try to aggregate in the states. We wanted to launch this here, and it's such a privilege to introduce our friends. And I'll have Bunny, too, chime in on the importance of this, and welcome, Matt.
Yes, Matt Krauss, our county commissioner from Tarrant County, former legislator, has been on our advisory board for Christians Engaged. Andrea Luce on the school board, and she is leading Restoring Faith in America. But FPA has not had a religious liberty initiative in a long time. And Christians Engaged and Family Policy Alliance are going to be leading with First Liberty on this. It's time for us to go on the offense instead of always being on the defense. And we're really excited to join our hands with Kelly and their team and see these monuments go up, see nativity scenes go up, see the "In God We Trust" mottos going in our things. I know several of our family policy councils are already working with First Liberty, but we're going to encourage everybody to join in this movement and really see restoring faith in America. With that, our dear friends.
Well, good morning. My name is Matt Krauss, as they said, and on behalf of First Liberty Institute, we are honored to be a part of SoConCon. This is the third one, I believe, and this is the third one that First Liberty Institute has supported, sponsored, and been at. And so we're honored to be here, Charleston, D.C., and now Indianapolis. And Kelly Shackelford, who's on the board advisory board for Christians Engaged, wanted me to say thank you all for being here. Thank you for the work that you do every day in the trenches to make sure that America can continue to be the great shining city city on a hill that we've always known it to be. And so on behalf of him, we're here today. In case you don't know about First Liberty, I just wanted to give you, I forgot. The lawyers in the room will understand this, but I got to give you a disclaimer, right? What we're about to tell you does not constitute legal advice. Every state, every circuit district is different, and so what works in Texas might not work in California, what works in Florida might not work in Oregon. So everything we're talking about today is kind of general. If you want to talk about specifics of actually getting something done in terms of expanding religious liberty in your area, please call us. That's what Andrea and I are here to do, is make sure that you're doing it the right way for the place that you're at and what you can do, which will hold up in court so we don't set any bad precedent, but actually make good precedent for everybody else in the country. So just know that's our disclaimer. Not everything applies to everybody in every single jurisdiction, but we can tailor it to you for what you can do to be the most effective in your area. So who is First Liberty Institute? We're the largest nonprofit dedicated solely to advancing and defending religious liberty in the country. There's some great organizations out there that tackle many different issues, and we appreciate them being in the battle. They do great work. First Liberty is focused solely on religious liberty work. And because of that, we've kind of become the experts in that area. And we're 9-0 at the Supreme Court, with many of those cases just taking place in the last 5 or 6 years. Now, that number will hopefully go to 10-0 pretty soon, because the Supreme Court just 2 weeks ago took another one of our cases, which will hopefully set even more precedent for all Americans, as has been done in the last couple. But 9-0 at the Supreme Court, hopefully soon to be 10-0 after this next term. We've got another big case with a 90% plus win rate. And for anybody who's been in the legal community knows that that's pretty unheard of. But that's because First Liberty is very careful to take on the right cases, to do it the right way, set the right precedent so that everybody can be enriched from that. But that is what aids our 90% success rate. So that's who we are. Again, the nation's leading experts on religious liberty. Now, we want to go back a little history on the First Amendment, right? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. People understood that for many years in our nation's history before we had this flawed notion of the separation of church and state, right? Now, this is a very learned, educated crowd, so I probably don't have to tell you that the separation of church and state was never intended to keep the church or religion out of government, but it was always intended to make sure the government stayed out of religion. Right? And so we're gonna underscore that right here. Some of our history and tradition of religious expression. So religious services in government buildings, including the U.S. Capitol. A lot of people don't know that at the founding of our country, the largest church in Washington, D.C. was the U.S. Capitol. They had up to 4 different denominations that would meet there on a weekly basis. Thousands of people would join in the U.S. Capitol to come worship every Sunday. Now, in our Constitution, if you'll remember, it says the president has 10 days to sign a law, but which day doesn't count? Sundays, right? So they took off Sundays. They were not there on Sundays, which mean the Capitol building had a lot of opportunity for worship services. And do you remember who wrote the letter to the Danbury Baptist saying that we weren't going to get involved in the government wasn't going to get involved in religion? Was Thomas Jefferson, right? And he used that word, separation of church and state. Well, when he was president, he actually attended church at the Capitol a few times during his presidency. So if he was really a strict separationist, if he really meant that there could be no union between separation of church and state, do you think the sitting president would have attended a religious service in the U.S. Capitol at that time? There's no way he would have done that. So even that alone undercuts the argument of the other side that there should be this separation of church and state. Chaplains and legislative prayers at all levels of government, local, state, national government. From the beginning of the country, we understood that we ought to seek God. In fact, in 1774, the first time Congress ever got together, the first thing that they did was pray. Right? And if you read the letter from John Adams to his wife Abigail, they were prolific writers. If you read their letters from that time in 1774, John Adams said, hey, we prayed. We asked God to give us wisdom. We asked God to give us discernment. And then he said, we read Scripture. He writes home to Abigail. He said, read that psalm, read that 35th psalm. He said, read it to your friends and read it to your father. Why read it to your father? Because his Abigail's father was the pastor back in Massachusetts, and that was the time, if you wanted to get information out to the rest of the community, you gave it to the pastor and they would get it out. And so he said, read that psalm. The founding fathers in 1774, the first time Congress got together, was so inspired by what they read in Psalm 35 that John Adams said, hey, read it to everybody in your community so you can be inspired as well. And then they also appointed a fast. Right? And why did they appoint a fast? Because John Adams wrote to his wife, so that millions will be upon their knees before their Creator, imploring God's assistance and His counsel in arms, right? And so the first time our founding fathers ever got together, they prayed, they read Scripture, and they fasted, right? So pretty incredible to think that was the heritage. And then people later on say there had to be a complete separation of church and state. Hasn't been that way from 1774 on, right? The New England primer was used in our schools. I don't know if you've ever seen that. David Barton with Wall Builders has replicas of that he always takes around to people. And if you look through that New England primer, we learned our building blocks of education by scriptural biblical principles, right? There's a whole section where you learn the alphabet. And for A, it was in Adam's fall, we sinned all, right? The letter C was Christ crucified for sinners died. So even when we learned our ABCs, it was from a biblical worldview and foundation. And those were in our public schools. And then how far have we fallen from our publicly funded universities teaching Christian values? Remember, Harvard started out as a seminary. You had Yale, you had Princeton, all these great publicly funded schools that taught things of God, taught things of religion. And so that is kind of the history and tradition of public displays of religion in America. So we understood that all the way from, like I said, about 1774 to about 1947. And that's when our Supreme Court started kind of chipping away at that notion that we had all known, right? You had Everson Board of Education, McCollum, you had Engel versus Vitale, Abington versus Shemp. And you've probably heard of these, again, because you're a very learned and educated crowd. Each one of them kind of chipped away at something else. Could you have religion in our schools? Could you have bus services that from religious groups to take them? Could you pray in schools? Could you have religious documents? Could you say the Lord's Prayer? Each one of these started chipping away and furthering building that inviolate separation of church and state, right? And then it kind of culminated in Lemon v. Kurtzman in 1971. And in that case, the court said, okay, we've got a three-pronged test that we're going to use anytime a public display of religion comes along. We're going to, does it have a secular purpose? Is there excessive entanglement? These three convoluted factors that were used from 1971 for a half century, right? But it was really hard to understand where the courts were going to go, where the lower courts were going to go. And I just want to highlight one of those real quick. On the same day in 2005, the Supreme Court handed down two opinions that had to deal with the Ten Commandments. One had to deal with the Texas Capitol. I was a state legislator there, so there's a huge granite monument on the Texas Capitol with the Ten Commandments on it. That was one case. That was Van Orden v. Perry. Then McCurry County versus Kentucky, or versus the ACLU, McCurry County was in Kentucky. All they wanted to do was put up the Ten Commandments on a piece of paper amongst a bunch of other historical documents. I think it was the Magna Carta, the Constitution, the Declaration. So you had a couple of ton granite monument that everybody could see when they walked by it on the grounds. And then you had this piece of paper that was going to hang on a wall that was amidst a bunch of other historical documents. Which one do you think the Supreme Court would say, okay, that one's not okay? You would think it's probably the more innocuous, just little piece of paper put up in a room amongst all these other documents, but they said no, that was a violation of the Establishment Clause because one of the county commissioners had happened to say something about we need to bring God back into America. This is a good way to, to bring the Ten Commandments back. So that showed that there was no secular purpose for putting this display up. Well, but the ton granite monument outside the Texas Capitol, that was given by a civic group, and it was many years ago, and it's been there for a long time. So it's kind of harder to say that was a religious purpose. That was more of a civic purpose, so we'll let that one stand. Just kind of incongruous. You're kind of like, how did you get there? Kind of a tortured analysis, right? And so I think after that, the justices started saying, maybe this isn't the greatest framework for us to go on. So in 2014, we started first seeing the chink in the armor of the Lemon test. In the town of Greece versus Galloway, one of the towns just wanted to pray before one of its meetings. Somebody had complained, and the Supreme Court said, no, we have actually a very long history in our country of praying before these things, just like we said, federal, state, local level. We could probably allow that to continue. That's probably not a violation or an establishment of religion. And then in 2019, which was another First Liberty case, American Legion versus American Humanist Association, there was a big cross, the Bladensburg Cross there in Maryland. And it was kind of off the side of the road. And one of the guys who would drive by it every day on his way to work would get upset. And he said, I shouldn't have to see this hideous thing, this thing that I don't agree with every day on my way to work. It's a religious symbol. I'm not a religious person, so that ought to come down. And on its way up to the Supreme Court, one of the appeals courts actually said, you know what, could we just cut off the arms of the cross and just leave the rest of it up, and would that be okay? And the government was like, yeah, that's a great idea. And we're like, no, that's not a great idea. That's a terrible idea. And so we went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, again, this was a war memorial. This was in honor of the men who had given their last full measure of devotion to their country, who had lost their lives, and this is how we wanted to celebrate them. If that cross had to come down, think about the ramifications around the entire country. Think about Arlington Cemetery. Cross after cross after cross after cross after cross, right? Stars of David, you have all those. Those would have all had to come down. And so I think the justices were like, well, if we're going to be so extreme, we're going to take these things this far, where's this going to stop? And so they said, no, that war memorial, that cross is okay. Again, kind of another chink in the armor to the Lemon test. And then in 2022, Bremerton versus Kennedy, you've probably heard about that. You may have seen the movie about Joe Kennedy, the high school coach who just wanted to kneel at the 50-yard line. That's all he wanted to do. School district said, you can't do that. It's a public school. We can't have any religion. You're not allowed to do that. And the Supreme Court said, no, you don't lose all your First Amendment rights just because you're a public school teacher. You have the right to express yourself in that manner. And so it was a huge victory. So 2022, huge victory for Joe Kennedy. But even more important, the Supreme Court said, you know what, we're no longer going to do the Lemon test. That's outdated. We're going to get rid of that. And so now the Lemon test was gone, which paved the way in Groff versus DeJoy in 2023, which is another First Liberty case, which built upon the victories in the Kennedy case. Gerald Groff was a postal employee. I don't know if you remember this case, but he felt a certain conviction not to work on Sundays. So he said, where can I work in this country where I know I will not have to work on Sundays? So he got a job at the post office, right? Because they don't deliver on Sundays. Well, then Jeff Bezos and Amazon asked the government, hey, would you start delivering our packages even on Sundays? Because we want those Prime members to be happy, and so they get their packages whenever they want to. They said, sure. And so now in Pennsylvania, where Gerald Groff was, all of a sudden they were going to have to work on Sundays. But Mr. Groff said, hey, that violates my convictions. I don't want to do that. Can you just have somebody else work the Sunday shifts? I'll work double shifts other days. I'll work the night shift. I'll work the early shift. Whatever you want me to do, just don't make me work on Sundays. And for some reason, the postmaster in his town in Pennsylvania said, no, you've got to continue to work on Sundays. They penalized him. They harassed him. They belittled him to make him do that. Well, Gerald reached out to us. We took it up to the Supreme Court, and we got a unanimous opinion that said, you do not have to work on Sundays. It was an incredible victory for Gerald Groff, but even more importantly, it built on the win that we had in Kennedy versus Bremerton. And the big shift was the Lemon test is gone. Now we're instituting a history and tradition test, right? So now the court's going to go look back in the history and tradition of America, and they're going to see, is this comport with what we were doing before, or does it not? And that's one reason we've been working so hard in the states that are pushing these Ten Commandments laws to put the Ten Commandments back in schools, saying that we feel very confident that that will survive constitutional scrutiny. Because there's not a document in American history, American law, American culture, American education, American media that has been more ubiquitous than the Ten Commandments. You might make the argument for the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, but other than that, nothing has been more widespread, more used in our history and tradition of our country than the Ten Commandments. And so Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, who put these Ten Commandments laws into place, hopefully more will join them soon. They're working their way through the courts. Of course, there's going to be litigation, but we're confident that when that gets up to the Supreme Court in the own test that they promulgated just a few years ago will say, no, the Ten Commandments is unique in American history. It comports with that history and tradition, and therefore it's going to be constitutional. And so our founder, Kelly Shackelford, who we've already mentioned, said, you know what? Now that the Lemon test was gone, it was used about 6,000 times since 1971 to inhibit public displays of religion. So why don't we, as Craig DeRoche just said, why don't we now go on offense, right? We're always on our heels. We're always reactionary. Now's our time to go on offense because this is the golden age of religious liberty that we haven't had in a half century. And so that birthed the Restoring Faith in America project. That birthed the Restoring Faith in America effort to take what was taken down from Lemon and put those back up. And so that's where Andrea Justice comes in because she is full-time with First Liberty. She's the one who actually does the grassroots movement. And at first, Kelly was like, do we go back in and do we challenge all these cases? Which you can kind of do, but more importantly, we can have grassroots efforts in every part of the country doing their own thing to try to restore faith in America. That's what Andrea Justice has been brought on to do. She's doing a great job, and I'm going to hand it over to her now to continue this part of the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. I'm so glad to be here. I'm so glad to be with First Liberty. I was a longtime First Liberty supporter, wannabe lawyer for many years, never went down that route, but have followed First Liberty's work for many, many years and been a supporter. And so when this opportunity came forth to me and sitting and having lunch with Kelly Shackelford and him telling me, we can go on offense, I had one of those like stirrings in my belly, and it was like the Lord was saying, this is what I have for you next, because I had quit corporate life, working for tech companies, having to do all this woke stuff that I no longer wanted to be a part of. And God said, I've got something more for you. I've got something better for you that you can work in the kingdom. And he connected me with this amazing job here at First Liberty. And I'm so excited to be partnering with the Family Policy Alliance Foundation and Christians Engaged, because we need grassroots people on the ground that are bold, like you all are in this room, that are willing to go take action and get this religious liberty restored down at the community level. So we did start the Restoring Faith in America. We want to go on offense, and we have opportunities throughout our communities, whether you're part of a military or government, school board member like I am, or part of a city council or county commissioner like Matt is. We have opportunities to restore faith in our communities. Public and private schools, if you know school teachers, kids of faith, we've got opportunities for them to live out their faith boldly. Calls to action that we want you as the family policy councils to get a part of and partner with us in. So what would that look like? These calls to action look like putting up displays of our national motto. It's on our money, right? Why should we not have displays of our national motto up in city council halls, in county commissioner dioceses, school board dioceses, in the classrooms of our schools or on the campuses of our schools? A lot of the states have laws in place that already support this, but a lot of people don't know about that. And so we're running programs to help people be aware of what the laws are, educate them of what the laws are, and then enable them with resources to go and take action in their communities. So we're going to have calls to action for the family policy councils to go donate In God We Trust signs across the country. We've got Jason Rapert here with the American History and Heritage Foundation. He's been doing this for a really long time. He's a great resource for the family policy councils to connect with. They manufacture the signs at a very easy cost, and they can get them to you very quickly so that you can go put them up in different locations throughout your community. The other thing we want to educate you all on through the Restoring Faith in America initiative and provide you resources is what is available for all the different stakeholders in public schools, but especially for students. So we have a call to action that we're asking the family policy councils to get involved in around student-led prayer. You guys have heard of the See You at the Pole events, and that's a great one to get involved with. It happens on a specific day every year, and we want to have you encourage students of faith in your communities to get involved with that. But in a broader level, there are many things that students can do at schools. Starting prayer clubs is a great way to get involved in their school and express their faith. If they allow other types of clubs in the schools, they can allow a prayer club in a school. So we want to encourage students of faith to act on that, and for adults like you to get behind them and provide them the support they need. Other calls to action that we want to partner with you in is prayer and government. Matt has talked about this a little bit already. We have a great history and tradition of this. But what we've seen at the local level is that school boards, city councils, county commissioners' courts, things like that, they're not opening up their meetings with prayer. They might have a moment of silence because they don't want to offend anybody. So we're asking you as Family Policy Council members to go petition your local leaders and your officials and provide them information and education as to why that's okay. And this is not just a performative thing, right? We don't want to do all these things just as performative actions. We know that there's power in prayer. There's power in prayer. So opening up a legislative meeting in prayer has meaning to it. And we want people of faith to go boldly to their local leaders and ask them to start opening up their meetings with a time of prayer. And then we also want to get you guys involved in helping to get nativities or other faith-filled holiday displays out into the public square this holiday season. This is a super easy one. But if your county courthouse doesn't have a nativity scene on it, find a way to get the money together to donate one. They're really not that expensive. And go find out what the process is in your community to have a display put up on county property or city property and get it done. And let's really celebrate the true reason of the season. And then the other calls to action that we have is we've done a lot of research around what the laws are on the books today in each state, and we're getting involved as much as possible, Matt especially, in really helping to see what legislators want to propose in upcoming sessions. So he mentioned that we passed laws in Texas and Arkansas this year around Ten Commandments displays, and there was also a law passed in West Virginia this year around In God We Trust displays in the schools. And we want to get behind legislators as they are crafting that legislation and encourage them to get them done. But after they pass that legislation, we want them to pass the baton to us. We've got to implement it. The legislation is no good if it doesn't get implemented, right? So we want to help get it implemented. And I think God has started to do an amazing thing in this area. There have been, with the Texas and Arkansas laws, so many groups that have come together in the grassroots. And we've had FPCs in Texas and Arkansas get on board with this, where we've created a website called restoreamericanschools.com. And again, it's 15, I think, organizations or so that have partnered with us in this. We've got Wall Builders leading the way, Million Voices, several other really critical groups that have all come together with their gifts to make this happen so that we can get these displays purchased at a low cost and into the hands of the different schools and on the walls in the classroom in Texas and Arkansas. And so we want to continue to do that in states across the nation as more laws are passed. And we also want to look at what laws are already on the books that maybe haven't been implemented so that we can go in after the fact and get it done. We're running a project in Georgia right now on a law that was passed way back in 2006 around historical document displays. And the law was passed, and there was a group that got started and got going, but then fizzled out. And so we wanted to come alongside them, restart that work, and finish the job and get those displays put up all across the state of Georgia in the county courthouses. The other thing that Georgia had on the books was a law in 2008 that was passed that allowed a Ten Commandments monument, like is on the Texas State Capitol lawn, to be put up in Georgia. And for whatever reason, it was never put up. So we are now working with the legislator in Georgia. I got a call yesterday that the governor is in support of getting it put up. So it looks like pretty soon we're going to have a Ten Commandments monument on the Georgia State Capitol lawn. So those are the types of things we're hoping you get involved with us in. There's also legislation around release time programs that we want you to help advocate for, and school chaplain bills. All of these things are just great ways to help bring a God consciousness back into the public square and restore what we have built this country on to be that city on a hill. So we thank you. We're excited to work with you, and I'm here to help in any way I can, so come out to our table if you've got any questions.
Yeah, and I will just say, please, that was fantastic. Thank you, Andrea. Let's just say, now as a county commissioner, I was in the state house for a long time. Now as a county commissioner, it's a lot easier to get things done, right? In the Texas House, there's 150 members, so you had to count to 76. Now in the commissioner's court, there's only 5 of us, so I only have to count to 3, right? Which is a lot better. So the first thing I ever did, being on the county commissioner's court since January, was we're going to put a 10 Commandments monument outside our historical courthouse in Tarrant County. And so don't think it just has to be at your state levels. All of you policy folks, think about your cities and your counties where they can get things done. Again, I'm going to bring up Jason Rapert with the National Association of Christian Lawmakers, but the American Heritage Foundation. He's helping us put that monument up. He's got a way that it can be privately donated. They can take the funds. They can help manufacture the monument. So we're trying to make it as easy as possible for people to do that. I know in Texas, we already have at least 1 or 2 other counties, just since we've done it earlier this year, have decided to put a 10 Commandments there. In any of your states where you're at, if you want to try to have a kind of effort like that, I would encourage you to contact Jason Rapert. On the religious release time instruction, the Supreme Court just came down with this Mahmoud decision. I don't know if you saw that. It was the case out of Maryland where they were trying to force LGBTQ curriculum without a parental opt-out. And so the court said, no, parents are in control of their children's religious education, which wasn't necessarily talking about release time instruction, but now opens the door for that. So we've partnered with a group called LifeWise Academy. If you haven't had that or not doing, yes, they're incredible. They've got a door that's now wide open that they haven't had before, just like we're seeing in a lot of these other areas of religious liberty. So if you're not doing stuff with religious release time programs, I'd encourage you to look into LifeWise Academy to try to get that going in your state. And the final thing I'll leave you with, you've probably heard this story before, but I always like to reinforce that, kind of like what Tony Perkins was just saying, that y'all were fighting the battle when nobody else was. That if you remember, John Quincy Adams was our only president that went from the White House back to Congress. And the only reason he went back to Congress was to try to defeat slavery. He felt like it was a moral evil, something the country needed to get rid of. So he fought and he fought and he fought. In fact, he fought so hard, Congress started having censure resolutions just to keep him from bringing any more of these anti-slavery petitions before Congress. And he fought and he fought and he fought and he fought, and he failed and he failed and he failed and he failed and he failed. And finally, somebody came up to him and said, "John, why do you keep beating your head against the wall? Why do you keep pushing for this and trying to do this even though you lose every time?" And he gave a quote that has stuck with me, and I hope it sticks with you. He said, "Duty is ours, results are God's." And so what you're doing in your states every day is you're doing your duty. You don't know what God's going to do with it. You don't know if you're going to have legislative successes. You don't know if you're going to have legislative losses. You don't know if it's going to fall on deaf ears this session or what it's doing, but you never know what God is doing with it. And what God was doing with John Quincy Adams is there happened to be a one-term congressman that served with him. John Quincy Adams literally died on the House floor, had a heart event, collapsed, and died right there in the Capitol. Well, there was one congressman that had spent 2 years learning from him during his only term in Congress, went home to where he was, ran a couple times, lost a couple times, ran a couple times, lost a couple times, finally became president of the United States in 1860. Abraham Lincoln was that one-term congressman who had learned from John Quincy Adams all those years ago and put a lot of the strategy into the Emancipation Proclamation. So what John Quincy Adams couldn't see is he was planting the seeds to one day free the slaves through Abraham Lincoln. You guys are planting the seeds. I don't know if you're Abraham Lincoln or John Quincy Adams, but keep going with it because duty is ours, results are God's. God bless you guys.